Now that we have opened our eyes and our ears, I'm going to invite Brian Quan up to come and speak a message to us. Brian is the pastor of Toronto Chinese Mennonite Church. On Thursday evening, he spoke to us about leaving and going and the seemingly unusual attraction of the wildness. Brian. Please pray with me. Our God, open our eyes, our minds, and our hearts. Be with Brian. Bless him as he speaks to us, and help us to hear your voice and work among us. Amen.
Good morning. Growing up in an immigrant home, we didn't have much toys or much time for vacations. And I don't think I missed out on a lot. When we did have new toys in the home, it actually didn't last very long. I usually had it dissected within a few hours. Now, without the technology that we have now, back then we just used our imagination. We made our own toys, we invented games, and we just discovered. So something as simple as finding something along the road, that would fill my day. And I remember finding such a thing on the road. I remember coming home from school, and I stumbled upon this, a golf ball. I had never really held a golf ball until that day. And as you know, a golf ball is very different than any other ball. It's not filled with air like a tennis ball or a basketball. Now, I don't play golf. I know many of you do. Water polo might be a better idea at this time. But some members in my congregation have compared my preaching to golf. They say of me, "Brian shoots straight, down the middle, and long." This ball was the bounciest ball I have played with up to that time. And this thing was wildly bouncy. And I wondered what was inside that made it so bouncy. I had to find out. Now, the shell of a golf ball is tough. I took a big brick and I tried to crush it, and nothing happened. Now, my dad did not own any power tools. He had a blunt wood chisel, a rusty screwdriver, and a hammer. I took those three and I went to the task. This thing was tough, tougher than any toy I've ever had. It was like an all-day marathon at Red Lobster. So with that chisel, I started to carve a little hairline crack down the ball. I could see the crack forming, and I took the screwdriver, I pried it in. I took the hammer and hit it, and finally I exposed the ball. And it was rubber inside. I expected that, but it was rubber that was made by a strand tightly wound around. And it was amazing. And it was amazing that now the ball was even more bouncy. I began to wonder, what made it so bouncy? Inquisitive minds need to know, so I took a pair of scissors and I started to cut away at the strands. And then I did not expect this. The ball began to unravel spontaneously. It just started to come apart on its own. This unraveling, this metaphor has stayed with me this past year. And through my reflection on some missional reading and through my missional study group with a number of Mennonite pastors, we have explored how the Christian church is experiencing this unraveling. We are going through a season of rapid unraveling. Now, in our current context, the church is going through changes that we have not experienced in the past. The future waters of Christianity is stormy. We have now entered into this post-Christendom era. And metrics, faith metrics down through the last 2 decades have generally been on the negative. It's been on the decline. Ichthyos. Now, when's the last time you have seen this emblem on a car bumper? I don't know about you, but at least where I live in the city of Toronto, I used to see it a lot more. A big golden or a silver fish on the car, and it has represented Christianity since the first century. Now, a few weeks ago, I saw it, but I almost missed it. I only saw it because it was 3 feet in front of me on a black car, and the fish was black. And I think this speaks of our culture. Christianity is blending. It's being camouflaged. It's blurring into society. So how are we going to navigate this post-Christendom, post-denominationalism, post-commitment? Is the church just going to fade away into the next century? What is the future of our local church, our national church? Stuart Murray asks this very question in his book. How will the church, our church, negotiate the demise of Christendom? Can it rediscover its primary calling, recover its authentic ethos, and regain its nerve? Now, in our story, Jesus invited his disciples on this radical movement. And you don't have to hang around Jesus very long to begin to feel your life is beginning to unravel. And the disciples find themselves in this quickly unraveling situation. An unseen, unpredictable storm was out in the distant sky. And in the middle of their transit, the rogue storm hits them, and hits them hard. How did they respond? What did they do? Well, in a time of distress in our ministry, what do we usually do? In our church, when it goes through difficulty and conflict, how do we respond? Well, we usually turn to our leaders, our pastors, the conference, to the executive secretary. These are the experts. They should know what to do. Well, amongst the 12 in the boat, 4 were experts: Peter, Andrew, James, and John. These guys were experts. They were literally born with a paddle and net in their hands. So between the 4 of them, we could hazardly guess they had almost 100 years of seafaring experience. These were professional fishermen. They knew how to read the waters, the waves, and the weather. They've seen it all and done it all. They have it under control. These 12 men were handpicked by Jesus. And in the previous chapter, we are told that Jesus gave them special privileges. In chapter 3, we read, he appointed 12, designating them apostles, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out evil spirits. Not only were they given the authority to preach, but to drive out evil spirits. Now, that's what you call power. Not many people are given that endorsement of privilege and that kind of power. I felt this power once. I was in junior high school, and they had given me the office of hall monitor. In my school, they called it the prefect. And when they gave me the red sweater, I felt the power. I could stand at the top of the stairwell and send a grade 9 all the way back down. So the disciples, they were given power. They should be able to handle the situation. The thick clouds were billowing and the waves were picking up, and I can imagine Peter at the helm yelling out instructions: batten down the hatches, stabilize the boom, watch that jib, hold that rudder, paddle hard. And Peter knows that lake like the back of his hand. He has gone back and forth hundreds of times. And we find it odd. Jesus is sleeping. In the middle of the storm, he sleeps on a cushion. And some commentators, they have suggested that this sleeping metaphor in Hebrew means trusting in God, putting your faith in the Father. I get it. But still, it's very unusual in this context for Jesus to sleep. So that makes me wonder, maybe Jesus was half awake. You know what I mean? One eye open, kind of watching his disciples bumbling around? Or perhaps the disciples chose not to wake Jesus. They decided, we don't need him. Not yet, anyways. What can a rabbi tell us about sailing? So they chose not to wake him because they were the experts. They were in their element. They applied their experience, worked hard, and pushed on through. Now, this sounds familiar to most of us. Far too often, this has been our default approach. I think it has been mine. Pull up your bootstraps, work hard. Now, it dawned on me that being Chinese is actually a wonderful pre-qualification for being Mennonite. We are passive and aggressive like you Swiss. We say yes, but we mean no. And we work almost as hard as you Russians. In the Chinese culture, there is a powerful work ethic. In our home, I grew up watching that and experiencing that from my parents. My dad was raised in a rural village in China, and he grew up in a farm. And he taught me, when things get tough, just put your head to the grindstone and overwhelm it with sheer force. Back in the 50s, my dad opened up the first dry cleaner in Toronto. There were many wet cleaners, but he opened up the first one. And I remember his routine very well. He would wake up in the morning, he would pack my brother, my sister, and I into the car in a station wagon. He would pick up 2 other visa students, drop us off at school, and he'd go to work. And I would not see him for 10 or 12 hours until it was dark at night. And my dad wanted me to learn something useful. So he brought me to the shop on a Saturday morning, and he says, I have a job for you. And he gave me a huge box of wired coat hangers. He says, your job is to take the coat hangers out and put the cardboard insert into them. Now, that was my job for the whole day. And after the whole day, it must have been 5,000 coat hangers. And my dad came over and he looked at me proud, and he said, isn't that great? Isn't that great that you can spend Saturday doing this? We're going to do this again tomorrow. Sound familiar? I know many in this room, you have experienced that in some ways. I would say every person in this room appreciates the gift and the value of work. To succeed, just apply more of what you know until you get through it. Now, what does this look like in a ministry context? Well, it usually means allocate resources for a study, bring in the specialists, set up tactical workforce, have consultants assess the situation, develop a strategic plan, implement it. After implementation, measure it, review it. Does this sound familiar? I'm not making light of this. I think goals, initiatives are vital for every organization, and particularly the church. And I have been part of the strategic planning process of Mennonite Church Eastern Canada, and I have been deeply impressed by the level of commitment and the care that the staff have. And I know that all 5 area churches and our national church deeply care for the church. But it was during our discernment conversation that I heard an unusual saying. Our consultant said this: culture eats strategy for breakfast. I never heard of that before, and I'm thinking, more Mennonite lingo. So I Googled it up, and the quote was actually from the late Peter Drucker, business guru and consultant. And what did he mean by this? He meant to warn us. He meant to say that your culture, your context will always trump a chart or a plan. Organizations, it will fail if you think your strategy or a chart or a change in organization will solve your problems. And I think our consultant was very wise to say this. So back to our story. The disciples, they had a winning attitude, can do. They had a solid strategy, but they underestimated the context. We have a storm, a good old-fashioned typhoon. And Mark says it was a fierce gale of wind. And he uses the Greek word mega. It was a mega whirlwind. And if we look at Matthew's account in the same story, the Greek word that he chooses is seismos. It was a mega seismos. And I understand seismos as an earthquake. So there was a quaking storm that the disciples encountered. And we can't really fault them for trying hard. But very quickly, they realized things were not working out. They were no longer in control, and their emotions escalated from trouble to distress to all-out terror. Now, the Chinese translation for the word fear is very interesting. I don't know Chinese very well. I did ask someone Chinese. We use picture language, and the word fear that they use here is chur, and it's made up of two separate characters, heart and departed. I will take some liberties. Jesus is saying, why has your heart departed? Why are you so afraid? And the irony, Jesus is still sleeping at the stern. I like Max Lucado's poetic description. The disciples scream, Jesus dreams. Thunders roar, Jesus snores. Fear had driven them to their basic instinct to stay alive. And in our story, we can hear and feel their terror. Jesus, don't you care? Don't you care if we die? They tried everything that they could, but they lost control. And if we boil it down, is that not what fear is? We've lost control. Once our control is gone, fear begins to set in, and it begins to overtake our sensibilities. I can also relate to another one of Lucado's story about enjoying horror movies. As a kid, I enjoyed watching horror movies. I would look in the TV guide for any horror movie that there was, and I would watch it. When I was about 9 years old, to my dad's regret, he let me watch the scariest movie I have watched to that date. I watched Dracula. I watched the entire movie. And after watching Dracula, I was convinced Dracula was outside my window. He was in the closet, and he was definitely in the basement. And I needed to go to the washroom that night, but that meant my toes had to go past the mattress and under. That's where Dracula would grab me. My fear had overtaken me. I had really wanted to go into my dad's bedroom to wake him up. But like Jesus, he was sleeping. It was a terrible, sleepless night. And the next morning, I knew I needed Jesus. So I found 2 popsicle sticks and I glued them in the middle. I kept that cross by my bed for many nights. Through the deafening wind, they finally called to Jesus for help. Jesus, don't you care if we die? Jesus opens up his eyes, lifts his head, and turns to face the full brunt of the storm. And he says, "Peace, be still." And then the winds dissipated, the waves calmed, and the boat came to a still. And the disciples stared at him dumbfounded. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid?" So what's happening here? I think there are many things happening here, but one of them is that the disciples had gone through a crash course about their limitations. Through their efforts, they realized there was some denial there. There were some false hopes. And Jesus used the storm to temper and dash their strategy. And Jesus uses the storm to help them to rediscover their orientation. They needed to rediscover and ask, what are we called to do? Where is our heart? Where is our will? Where is our mind? Where exactly is our faith coming from? Now, back in my seminary days, my New Testament professor fondly quoted Jürgen Moltmann, and his name came to my mind again. And Moltmann's pivotal work was a book written a while back. It was called The Theology of Hope. And it was born out of the most unlikely circumstances. It was born out of a prisoner of war camp after the war. And he proposed that Christian hope should be the central motivating factor in the church and in the life of a Christian. This is what he writes. That is why faith, whenever it develops into real hope, causes not rest, but unrest, not patience, but impatience. It does not calm the unquiet heart, but is itself this unquiet heart in man. Those who hope in Christ can no longer put up with the reality as it is, but begin to suffer under it, to contradict it. Peace with God means conflict with the world, for the goad of the promised future stabs inexorably into the flesh of every unfulfilled present. Now, this sounds so contradictory. Should hope not make us feel more at ease? Should we not feel less anxiety? What is Moltmann saying? He's saying that faith that develops into real hope cannot say, we've arrived. We've made it. It cannot say that. It cannot say that my life is smoother now. My life is more comfortable. No. Hope constantly stirs us to move with Jesus, to fix our eyes on him, and to see promises unfilled. Real faith and hope causes us to wade into uncertain messiness. It causes us to walk in uncertainty. So Jesus takes the storm to help his disciples, to cast away old conventions, to put away false pride, false hope, and our preconceived notions of how it's supposed to turn out. The Spirit of God moves in strange and mysterious ways. So after Jesus demonstrates his power over the storm, he says, "Why are you so timid? How is it that you have no faith?" And they became very much afraid and said to one another, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now I'm going to take some liberties again at my unknown Chinese. There is a different word of fear that is used there. And the two characters that comprise fear here is heart and white. I understand this as, why has your heart drained of blood? Where is your courage? Why are you so petrified? The storm's gone. Why? Tim Keller says, because Jesus was as unimaginable as the storm itself. The storm had immense power. They couldn't control it. Jesus had infinitely more power, so they had even less control over him. So the storm had driven primal fear out of them. The storm subdued them and had the power to destroy them. It was a self-centered fear that came out, a fear of loss of life and limb. But after the storm, the fear was different. The fear that is presented here had moved from self-centeredness outward. They experienced awe of a transcendent God they could not understand. They realized that Jesus could do only what God could do. Rabbi Pollock, he says this, "The edge between fear and awe is razor thin. Fear and awe are two sides of the same coin. We can be fearful because we fear loss of control, but at the same time, we can be awed at the mysterious experience of a good and holy God. That's what the disciples experienced. They experienced this otherworldly experience that moved them. Let me wrap up with two stories. I enjoy reading epic stories of human exploration. I love National Geographic. And some of you may have heard of the name of a Montreal woman named Mylene Paquette. 1 year to this day, she started an epic journey to cross the Atlantic Ocean on her own. And she would row solo. There would be no sail, no support, and no backup. She started in Halifax, and she decided to row to France. So she was doing well. Up until about 30 days out, she ran into trouble. She heard that a sea storm was coming into her path. So she crawled into her cabin. She embraced herself for the onslaught. And 10-meter waves hit the boat over and over and over again. And by the time it was done, it destroyed her satellite phone. She lost her anchor, and her supplies were short. And without an anchor, she could row for a whole day, and the tides would bring her back to the same place. And her attempt was done. Without much hope, she crawled back into her cabin, and she radioed to home base in Halifax and told them it's not going to end well. So she just crawled in, and she just prayed for a miracle. She was all alone in the North Atlantic, and without really much hope, she received an answer from home. And the answer said, help is on its way. She had a glimmer of hope, but she thought, help would be days away, and what could they offer me? What she didn't know that there was a boat not far off. About 100 kilometers away, there just happened to be a boat. It was midway going from New York to Southampton, England. And the boat was the Queen Mary 2, the world's biggest ocean liner. 200 feet tall, 1,000 foot long. And this, I can imagine Mylene saying, I must be dreaming. The Queen Mary swept in to save the day. Mylene did not need to be towed. They helped her resupply. And to take care of her needs, they lowered down to her a kit. What did they give her? They gave her a new anchor, a new satellite phone, chips, hot chocolate, and a roll of duct tape. After the drop, all 3,000 passengers were on one side of the ship watching this event unfold. And after they had dropped off what she needed, in British tradition, everyone on the boat yelled out, hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! And the crowds, they cheered wildly, and they watched her kind of drift off into the horizon. And Mylene was overwhelmed. All she could do was grab a piece of paper and write a makeshift sign. It said, thank you. Thank you, Queen Mary. And as the ship finally departed, you can see Mylene, she just drops to her knees on the chair. And I can imagine her saying, I cannot believe this. I just prayed a little prayer, and you send me this. That's all. This is a powerful story that Mylene can tell for the rest of her life. And when we hear of stories like this, our imaginations bring us to think of amazing, great stories. The experience of awe with God is not always in the big stories. It's not always in the tornado or the storm. Sometimes we discover God in the quietness of everyday, normal things. We discover and rediscover Him in the womb. In our church, we've been trying very hard to reach out to the local community. Our local community is mainly Eurocentric, middle class, and we have a wonderful daycare that serves about 30 families. And every year we serve pancake to over 100 kids and families, and we try hard to connect with them. But honestly, it's been very hard. It's been hard for us to engage and to connect with them on a personal level. This has not translated to trusting, personal friendships. But one day, Michelle, my wife, comes home and she says, "We've been invited to dinner." And I thought, finally, all of this work has paid off. And she said, "We're going to Farah's home." Farah's not her neighbor. Farah is a co-worker of Michelle's, and Farah is a Muslim woman, and her husband are Sunni Muslim, practicing Muslims, and they knew full well that I'm a Christian pastor. Now, I don't know how this happened. Michelle will be the first to admit she does not have the gift of evangelism. But what she does have is Southern hospitality. She was born and raised in Brazil. Now, they had become genuine friends over work. So here I am driving over to the home, and I began to feel very self-conscious. I hardly know this family, and I felt a little tense and guarded because I did not know what to expect. And I hoped that the topic of religion would not come up. It would ruin a very good evening. As soon as we arrived, the family welcomed us, and they made us feel like the most important people in the world. They put me at ease because they offered us tea and this wonderful array of appetizers. And Farah's husband, he was very open to talking. He talked about his family back in Iran. He talked about the political situation. He showed me on the mantle a picture of the mosque he attends back home. And then he took me out to his garden where he grows hot peppers. They were a very gracious family. And then they invited us into the formal dining room for a formal dinner, and the food was fantastic. And in situations like this, Michelle and I, we usually say a quick and private prayer with our eyes opened. So as we sat around the dinner table with that food in front of us, our guest went quiet and they stared at me. My heart rate went up. Knowing that I was a Christian pastor, Farah's husband said, "Brian, would you pray and give thanks for the food tonight?" I was speechless. I looked to Michelle, not knowing what to say. Can you imagine that? A Muslim family asking a Mennonite pastor to pray for the food in their home. I was in awe. I was on holy ground. Unimaginable, but Jesus was there. So with a trembling heart, I prayed, giving thanks for the food, thanking my good friends for extending the peace and the presence of Christ. We have an inspiring God who continues to show himself in new ways we can never imagine. God is with us in the storm, through the storm, and after the storm. My golf ball. What happened to my golf ball? I'm not sure. It's not very good for golf anymore. The shell was gone. There was not much more to unravel. What was left? The core. Not so bouncy, but still round, still solid, still a ball. It probably ended up where I had first found it, along the sidewalk, on the edge. I imagine it was rediscovered by another child. I can imagine the ball filling her heart with joy, with curiosity, with new games. I can imagine the ball being exchanged with other new children, filling their hearts with new joy, new wonder, and new awe.